What if the deadliest threat to a carrier pilot wasn't enemy fire, but the very design of his own ship? Picture an 872-foot steel runway with only one way on and one way off. Fighters circling low, gas slumping from their tanks, nerves taut as piano wire. A single missed arresting wire or a busted hook stops everything. Planes become obstacles, recoveries halt, launches freeze. Pilots are forced to ditch priceless aircraft into the sea, while crews scramble to clear a microscopic slice of deck. It sounds like chaos, but the real shock is that this life-or-death bottleneck could be erased by a tiny, almost laughable tweak, an 8-degree rotation. For decades, a fatal flaw was built into the heart of naval power, a flaw that an 8-degree change would erase forever. It wasn't a weapon, it wasn't a tactic, it was geometry. The straight flight deck turned every landing into a bottleneck, a single runway with one deadly outcome if something went wrong. Planes circled, fuel ran low, men made impossible choices. A tiny tilt, just a sliver of angle, promised to turn that choke point into a runway with an escape hatch, to change a likely death into a second chance. That quiet possibility would soon collide with war and invention in one crucial moment. May 1945. The USS Enterprise sits in the Pacific, a vast steel island under a bruised sky. 30 aircraft whisper and roar in circles above an 872-foot runway that gives you one way on and one way off. Fuel gauges drift toward empty. Pilots watch the needle like a second hand. Light grows thin. Radios crackle. Below, the deck is a single narrow lane where one mistake becomes a sentence. Every approach is a gamble. Every missed wire means a ditching or a death. The carrier that projects power feels suddenly fragile, not because of enemy flak, but because the ship itself has become a countdown. The landing process is a brutal bottleneck. One by one, planes slam onto the deck, snag an arresting wire, and are forced to stop dead. No rolling past, no slipping around. Every recovery demands hands, chains, and razor-thin timing. With dozens circling on fumes, a single missed wire or a slow crew turns the flight deck into an immovable jam, where every second is a life-or-death gamble. Crews rush to fold wings and taxi each plane forward, fingers and wrenches moving like a pit crew on fire. Every second counts as they shove one armed, hot-running fighter into the tiniest pocket on the deck, praying it clears before the next bird touches down. There's barely a sliver of room. One mistake and the whole chain locks up, leaving pilots circling with dying fuel. Dozens of planes circle overhead like vultures. A single missed wire or a stubborn gearbox strips the deck of its one lifeline, and everything stops. Pilots sit hunched over throttles, fuel needles sinking toward red, radios crackling with frantic calls. Below, deck crews freeze mid-step. You can feel the whole ship hold its breath. There's nowhere to go, no shoulder to pull into, just a narrow strip of steel and time ticking away. For any pilot running on fumes, a mechanical hiccup isn't an inconvenience, it's a sentence. Stay up and hope, or go down and pray. When fuel runs out, there's no runway to aim for. Pilots cut power and ditch their multi-million-dollar fighters into the cold Pacific, praying the life raft holds and rescue comes in time. Boats and helicopters sweep the water. Every splash becomes a desperate gamble. Airframes lost, missions crippled, and men clinging to canvas while the carrier can only watch. Once the downed pilots and their machines are hauled back aboard, the flight deck turns into a crowded, static parking lot of armed, fueled warplanes. Engines cold, cannons hot, bombs and drop tanks hanging under wings. Rows of aircraft sit bumper to bumper, wings folded like shutters. A brittle, synchronized stillness that smells of avgas and oil. It's not just clutter, it's a live magazine strewn across steel, where one misstep, one spark, one accidental throttle could turn a carrier into a bonfire. For pilots circling low and deck crews hustling to make room, the ship becomes painfully, terrifyingly useless. No more launches are possible. The deck turns into a frozen, armed parking lot, each plane a loaded bomb that can't move. Crews scramble like choreographers, folding wings, chaining brakes, and taxiing aircraft inch by inch to make a few precious feet of runway. It's painstaking, slow-motion ballet, precision under a deadline. What would take minutes ashore takes up to an hour at sea, and every minute a carrier sits immobilized is a window for disaster. The whole air wing becomes hostage to the landing cycle. This operational paralysis is known as the deck cycle problem. When the flight deck becomes a static parking lot, the carrier loses what makes it deadly: flexibility. Admiral Mark Mitcher had already identified it as a critical weakness in 1944. A single missed wire or tiny mechanical hiccup could freeze an entire air group, strand pilots on empty tanks, and turn a warship into a sitting duck. A carrier packed with planes couldn't surge or respond, it could only wait. The problem wasn't just inconvenient, it was existential. Whoever fixed that bottleneck would change naval aviation forever. A carrier with nearly 100 planes on board sounds like unstoppable power. In reality, it was painfully limited. With only one deck and one lane on and off, a carrier could realistically mount 1 or 2 major strikes a day, no more. Between those sorties, the ship became a floating arsenal. Dozens of armed, fueled aircraft jammed together, engines cold, crews scrambling to fold wings and clear a single tiny strip of runway. That concentration of men and munitions turned a capital ship into an exposed depot instead of an impregnable fortress. A vulnerability Admiral Mitcher had already flagged, and one that would soon be cruelly exposed. History proves it. At Midway in 1942, the straight deck wasn't just inconvenient, it was lethal. 4 Japanese carriers found themselves mired in the deck cycle, decks stacked with armed, fueled planes, helplessly exposed. When American dive bombers arrived, there was nowhere to go. The ships went from kings of the sea to ticking powder kegs in minutes. Aircraft and crews burned, decks shattered, the fate of fleets decided by a design flaw no one had yet fixed. Midway wasn't just a battle, it was a brutal lesson in how a tiny operational bottleneck can become a strategic catastrophe. Their decks were a nightmare, rows upon rows of planes, fuel drums, and ordnance piled like kindling, crews elbow-deep in pumps and wrenches, engines cooling, wings folded, pilots offloading ammo. They couldn't launch, they couldn't recover. With every minute, the ship turned less into a fighting force and more into a sitting target, an explosive parking lot waiting for a spark. When American dive bombers appeared, the carriers weren't just ships, they were floating powder kegs. Decks were stacked with fueled, armed aircraft, crews elbow to elbow, refueling and rearming in a brutal, time-pressed ballet. One lucky hit, one ruptured fuel line, and a single spark could turn the flight deck into an instant inferno. Smoke choking the bridge, fires racing along fuel-soaked planking, and trapped pilots circling helplessly overhead. Midway made that terror plain. These floating airfields were as fragile as they were powerful. Their greatest strength turned into an almost literal fuse waiting to be blown. The destruction was brutal and absolute. Ships transformed into towering bonfires in a matter of minutes. Planes stacked like kindling. Fuel and bombs turned the flight deck into an inferno, and there was nowhere for aircrew or aircraft to go. It wasn't enemy skill alone that did it. It was a design flaw writ large. The straight deck's single inflexible lane turned every recovery into a choke point, every refuel into a hazard. When it mattered most, carriers couldn't clear or launch fast enough. Midway didn't just cost ships and pilots, it exposed a deadly structural weakness that would haunt naval planners from that day on. Midway burned the lesson into every admiral's log. A packed deck was a death sentence. Navies became obsessed with deck cycle efficiency, how fast you could launch, recover, and relaunch without turning your carrier into a sitting target. Carrier battles stopped being slow attrition fights and turned into quick-draw contests. The side that could clear its deck first could throw fighters and strike aircraft while the other was frozen in recovery. Doctrine, training, and tactics all bent toward shaving seconds off landings and launches. Ship design and task group makeup were suddenly judged by one metric: how fast you could break the cycle. It boiled down to one terrifying fact: carrier warfare had turned into a race. Launch first, clear your deck for recovery, and you kept the initiative. Fail, and you were sitting duck. A full deck was not just inconvenient, it was lethal. Armed, fueled aircraft parked like kindling, nowhere to land, no room to maneuver. An enemy strike arriving at that moment didn't need precision, it needed timing. The winner walked away with aircraft in the air and options. The loser watched his flight deck become a death trap. Those stakes forced navies to rethink everything and to try desperate, clumsy workarounds. The Navy tried to brute force the deck cycle problem, 3 carriers doing the work of one. One launched strikes, another recovered the returning pilots, a third rearmed and refueled. It worked, barely. It ate ships, crews, and precious coordination time. Inelegant, costly, and tactically fragile, it was a bandage on a problem that demanded a redesign, not more ships. They tried to paper over the flaw with brute force, 3 carriers juggling launches, recoveries, and rearming. But in June 1944, the ruse collapsed at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. It took 97 harrowing minutes to recover 226 returning aircraft, 97 minutes of low-fuel needles crawling toward empty. Planes circled like wounded birds. When fuel ran out, pilots had only the ocean. The sea became a graveyard of aluminum and lives, dotted with floating airmen and bobbing wreckage. The Navy could claim the battle, but in that moment it was losing another fight entirely, against the limits of its own ships. They began to run out of fuel mid-air and fall out of the sky. Pilots were forced to ditch in the cold gray swells. Life rafts bobbed among overturned canopies, and the ocean turned into a patchwork of smeared paint and twisted metal. Men who had survived combat deaths were now gambling with something else: the carrier's inability to bring them home. Planes meant for the next strike were suddenly floating wrecks. Ships spent hours pulling survivors from the water, while decks lay clogged and useless. The Navy could claim victory on the map, but on the sea it was losing a quiet, humiliating battle against its own machines. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the picture was eerily familiar, but worse in small scale. The Royal Navy's carriers were tinier, their decks narrower, their margins for error vanishing. Planes stacked up like sardines. A single missed wire meant not just a delay, but a crippled ship and a pile of men in the water. There was no luxury of 3 carrier workarounds. Every sortie counted, every minute was precious, and the Admiralty could see the same deadly bottleneck forming like a noose. The problem demanded more than tinkering. It demanded a new way of thinking. Desperate, bold minds began to sketch alternatives. Captain Matthew Slattery of HMS Illustrious quit treating the deck like a single highway and started treating it like a railroad switch. He marked an offset landing line so incoming planes could touch down on one lane while others waited, folded, and parked forward. It was audacious and unorthodox, a small lateral tweak that might unclog the carrier. But the first trials were risky, improvised, and anything but calm. They painted the offset line and then, almost defiantly, started throwing planes at it. The first approaches were ragged, tires smoking, tailhooks missing by inches. One aircraft cartwheeling into the wires, another skidding wide. Men on deck ducked and swore. It was dangerous and chaotic. But those painful, close-run failures revealed the point. You didn't need the whole flight deck to land. A plane could use a narrow, angled lane, come to rest out of the landing path, and clear the deck while launches continued. The accidents were ugly, and they were proof. Out of those messy, dangerous trials came an elegant, almost ridiculous insight. A pilot doesn't need the ship's whole width to land, just a narrow, predictable slice of it. In other words, a successful touchdown only requires a defined lane for wheels and hook. The rest of the deck can be treated as parking. That tiny realization flips the problem on its head. Instead of shuffling the entire flight deck like a congested airport, you could create a dedicated landing corridor and keep everything else out of the way. It's a simple geometric truth with enormous consequences. A small piece of space that could buy planes time and save lives. This small observation did more than tweak procedure. It lit a fuse. It wasn't a carrier admiral who sketched the fix on a map, but Dennis Campbell, a physicist who looked at the deck like an engineer looks at a problem, not as tradition, but as geometry and flow. Where others saw a single sacred lane, Campbell saw intersecting paths, options, and escape valve. He quietly tore open the mental rules that had trapped carrier aviation for decades, and in that unassuming instant, the straight deck's fate was sealed. Because someone trained to think in angles realized a few degrees could rewrite the rules of naval flight. Campbell didn't see a runway. He saw a junction, a network of tracks and switches where planes could be routed apart instead of bottlenecked together. Instead of treating the deck like one stubborn lane that every aircraft had to share, he pictured diverging paths, clear routes for arriving and departing traffic, and a tiny shift that would let motion flow instead of collide. It's the kind of reframing a physicist loves, simple, geometrical, and brutally practical. That mental switch turned an operational headache into a solvable routing problem, and it set the stage for a concrete proposal that would soon be drawn on paper. In January 1944, Dennis Campbell did something very simple and very bold. He put the whole idea on paper, not as a grand blueprint, but as a small clinical sketch. Tilt the landing lane 5 degrees to port. Just 5 degrees. Tiny on a protractor, enormous in practice. He treated the flight deck like railway tracks with switch points, not a single blunt runway, and the angle was the switch. It wasn't a flashy invention, just a quiet, counterintuitive nudge of geometry. But that nudge promised to let landing and launching become two separate, non-colliding operations instead of one deadly one-way street. In theory, a plane could touch down on that angled strip, snag an arresting wire, fold its wings, and taxi forward along the diverted lane, clearing the center of the deck in seconds. That tiny sideways shift turns the flight deck into 2 lanes, one for recovery, one for launching. Simple, brilliant. Then picture it. While one plane threads down the angled landing lane and taxis clear, another thunders off the bow. No collisions, no waiting. 2 separate traffic lanes on one deck. Recovery and launch running at the same time. The bottleneck disappears. The vicious deck cycle is fractured, replaced by constant motion instead of paralysis. It should have felt like a eureka moment. Instead, the idea slammed into a wall of suspicion. Senior officers recoiled. Too risky, too unorthodox. Carriers were the crown jewels of a navy. You didn't rewrite their rules on a hunch. The brass wanted proof, not thought experiments, and lives, countless lives, hung on every design choice. Meetings multiplied. Engineers scribbled objections. Admirals quoted doctrine. Some called it clever but impractical. Others warned new dangers they couldn't afford. Still, the notion wouldn't die. A few test pilots and stubborn innovators kept nudging, and that quiet pressure would soon force a real trial. Despite the resistance, the Admiralty grudgingly approves a live test aboard HMS Triumph. In August 1944, crews paint a single, shallow, 5-degree line across the steel deck, chalk and fresh enamel cutting a new path into naval habit. It looks almost trivial, But on that hot, salt-sprayed flight deck, the painted line feels like a provocation, a small geometry daring fate itself. Lieutenant Commander Eric Brown straps in, breath steady, eyes locked on the thin painted line that promises to change everything. The deck rushes up beneath him. He bites the radio static, eases the throttle, and the plane kisses the angled paint with pinpoint precision. Wheels, wire, nothing but a perfect roll. For a moment, the carrier holds its breath. Then the deck exhales. It worked. It works. When Lieutenant Commander Eric Brown kissed rubber to painted steel and rolled to a stop, the room that had been full of skeptical officers exhaled as one. This wasn't a clever sketch on paper anymore. It was real. For the first time, a carrier could swallow a landing and spit out a launch at the same time. Two air operations that had once fought for the same tiny patch of deck could now live side by side. The implications hit like a physical jolt. Faster cycles, fewer lost pilots, a completely different kind of naval air war. Still, it was only a first step, promising but imperfect. The tests proved the idea lived up to its promise in one sense. You could land on an offset line, but the victory was partial. A 5-degree tilt cleared some traffic, yes, but not enough to breathe easy. Landing planes still threaded a crowded deck, squeezed past parked, fueled, and armed aircraft, and pilots still risked clipping a wing or fouling a wire in the tight shuffle. In practice, the strip felt more like a clever patch than a cure. It bought seconds, not safety. So, the innovation was real, but incomplete, promising, fragile, and with the war winding down, it was in danger of being filed away before it could be perfected. The ink was barely dry on the trial reports when the world turned. Victory meant demobilization. Budgets were slashed. Attention drifted to rebuilding cities and peacetime life. Admirals who argued for risky changes were reassigned or retired. Test pilots went home. Curious ideas were shuffled into annexes and filing cabinets. The angled deck reports, sketches, calculations, eyewitness notes of daring landings sat unread, a practical fix swallowed by exhaustion and bureaucracy. For 7 years, that bright, elegant solution would slumber, its fate sealed under a stack of papers. Would anyone ever pull it back out? The idea lies dormant for 7 years, a secret hidden in a filing cabinet. Paper turned brittle, ink faded. Men who had pushed it drifted away to politics, peacetime jobs, pensions. The war's urgency evaporated, budgets tightened, and innovation found itself deprioritized. A neat diagram and a few test notes sat under a rubber band while the world moved on, headlines louder than hulls. For half a decade, the angled deck was an odd footnote, an academic curiosity, not an operational must-have. Quiet, patient, waiting. It would take new jets, new dangers, and one curious American to pull that buried idea back into the light. The year is 1951. The world has changed. Propeller-driven workhorses that once lumbered back to carriers are being swept aside by a new, angrier breed. Jets. Faster, heavier, less forgiving. They arrive with a raw, impatient energy that the old straight decks were never designed to handle. Approaches that once allowed for a margin of error now leave seconds, and pilots, no room to recover. The forgotten angled deck notes, filed away years earlier, suddenly read like a lifeline. What had been a clever efficiency trick could now be the thin line between a safe go-around and a fatal crash. By 1951, the game had changed. Jets weren't just faster, they were heavier, hungrier for speed on approach, and utterly unforgiving of small mistakes. Where a propeller plane could limp home, a jet arrived hot and brutal. Higher stall speeds, less time to correct, and far more kinetic energy the moment its wheels hit the deck. That old straight runway, a narrow one-way street, suddenly looked like a death trap. No room to recover, no grace for a missed wire. What had been a logistical nuisance became a lethal design flaw, and every carrier landing now carried a new, terrifying question. What happens if the pilot errs? Commander Walter Boone, a U.S. Navy test pilot, is facing a new, deadly reality. Heavier, faster jets that turn a carrier's straight deck into a trap. He's a man of skill and nerves, and he knows time is not on his side. In cramped briefing rooms and on anxious approaches, he searches for an answer. Anything that might stop pilots from running out of options. He needs a solution fast. Then, by pure luck, Boone finds it. A brittle, overlooked file tucked between pages of routine reports. He unfolds diagrams drawn in pencil, grainy photos of Triumph's painted line, and the terse notes of a British test pilot who had already tried angling a deck 5 degrees to port. It reads like a modest engineering memo, almost apologetic. But to Boone, exhausted and desperate for a fix, those timid sketches look like a map. The idea is there, half-baked and quietly brilliant. It makes him sit up. It makes him think, this is more than efficiency. This could be survival. When Boone dug into the brittle reports, something clicked. These British experiments had fixed a choke point, sure, but only from a timing spreadsheet. Their aim had been efficiency. Squeeze more launches and recoveries into the same hour. What jumped out to Boone was what they hadn't been trying to fix at all. The human cost of failure. He saw the deck not just as a sequencing problem, but as a runway with no exit. A missed wire on a jet wasn't just a delay, it was a killing field. In a single instant, he understood the missing piece. This was as much about survival as it was about speed. Then Boone sees something more. Not a clever dockyard trick, but a life-saving idea. The angled deck wasn't just about squeezing more sorties out of a crowded runway. It could be an escape hatch. For jets that came in too hot, for pilots who missed the wires, the angled strip offered a clear path to throttle up and fly again, instead of slamming into parked aircraft or a barrier. Suddenly, the problem stops being an efficiency headache and becomes a question of survival. A small rotation of the deck could mean the difference between an insurance claim and a saved life. Boone didn't just see efficiency, he saw salvation. He realized the Brits had solved half the puzzle. He could finish it. What if the landing line wasn't merely angled to save time, but tilted enough to give a pilot a way out? By nudging that 5 degrees up to 8 or even 10, you'd carve a literal runway for escape. Miss the wires, hit full power, and peel off safely instead of plowing into parked planes. It was simple, almost audacious, geometry as lifebelt. And with jets coming fast and unforgiving, that extra few degrees suddenly looked like the difference between catastrophe and survival. A bolter, a jet pilot who misses all the arresting wires, is a pilot's worst nightmare. At high speed with heavy fuel and live ordnance, there is no margin for error. On an ordinary straight deck, a missed hook becomes a moment of pure mechanical horror. There's a barrier ahead, parked fighters behind, and only a sliver of steel runway beneath you. You feel the wire whip past beneath your wheels and know you have seconds to live or die. Every instinct screams to throttle up, but there's nowhere to go. Until someone like Boone imagines rotating the whole problem 8 degrees. On a straight deck, a bolter is not a second chance, it's a sentence. A jet that misses the wires has no place to go. The bow is a wall, the waist a parking lot of armed, fueled aircraft, and the safety barrier is the last gasp. At landing speed, well over 100 miles an hour, there's no scrub, no climb. The pilot slams the throttle and prays, but momentum and metal have already decided the outcome. Aircraft tear into barriers or plow through rows of planes like torpedoes. It destroys machines and it kills. In carrier aviation, a missed wire is almost always fatal. Boone's idea changed everything, not because it made landings prettier, but because it stole death back from chance. That 8-degree tilt turned a carrier from a single-file death trap into a forgiving runway with an escape hatch. The moment a jet failed to snag a wire, it no longer hurtled into parked planes or a barricade at 100 miles an hour. It had a lane to survive. Suddenly, pilots could plan for a second try instead of a last desperate prayer. Strategy shifted. Engineering priorities shifted. The risk calculus of carrier aviation was rewritten by a quiet rotation of less than 10 degrees. Boone's 8-degree trick meant that a botched landing no longer had to end in catastrophe. Instead of slamming into a parked plane or the barrier, a pilot could bury the throttle, feel the jet's roar climb, and sprint down the sloping deck. The wheels might kiss the deck and the arresting wires would slap past, useless, but the angled runway offered a clear, unobstructed lane off the ship's port side. With full power, he could peel away, climb, and circle for another attempt. What had been a one-way ticket to disaster became simply a second chance, a built-in safety valve for the deadliest moment in carrier aviation. It wasn't a gadget or a clever procedure, just geometry. That 8-degree tilt became a built-in safety valve for the single deadliest moment in carrier aviation, the dreaded bolter. Instead of hurtling into barriers or a parked flight deck at full speed, a jet could simply throttle up, ride the angled lane, and fly free, buying a pilot a second chance where there had been none. It transformed a near-certain fatal error into a recoverable mistake. For Boone, that shift wasn't about efficiency alone. It was about saving lives. And with that realization, he was ready to put the idea where it mattered most, on a carrier's deck. In March 1951, Commander Walter Boone pulls off what everyone said he couldn't. He sells the idea. He lays out the forgotten British tests, the math, and the lethal problem jets now pose. Faster, heavier, far less forgiving of error. His superiors grumble, then relent. Permission is granted. The USS Midway will wear an experimental 8-degree landing strip. The test is a go. Crews are ordered to paint a temporary 8-degree landing strip over the existing axial deck. It sounds almost absurd, just paint. But for jets roaring back from the sky, for pilots running out of options, that painted line is an experiment with lives attached. Sailors hustle, chalk the angle, and overnight, the fate of a risky idea rests on nothing more glamorous than a stripe of paint. They run the drill. Engines roar. Deck crews shift like clockwork. Planes steam off the bow as others come screaming in on the new painted line. Arresting gear, catapults, signal flags, everything synchronizes into one intricate choreography. For nearly an hour, the carrier becomes a machine of launches and recoveries. Each move measured, each second weighted with the promise of proof. The results hit like a punch to the gut. What used to be an agonizing, deck-clogging 90-minute recovery now took just 18. Planes no longer sat like loaded time bombs. Launches and landings flowed in quick, efficient bursts. Sailors who had spent hours shoving, folding, and praying suddenly found space to breathe. Commanders who'd accepted the deck cycle as an immutable fact now saw it undone by a single painted line. This wasn't a tweak or a trick. It was a fundamental change in tempo and safety, turning carriers from fragile depots back into lethal, flexible airbases. But the most important test is yet to come. The deck cycle problem is shattered. What had once been a torturous 90-minute crawl now happens in minutes. Launches and recoveries folding into a seamless, almost clinical rhythm. But efficiency isn't the whole story. A painted line and faster turnover prove the idea works on paper. And in practice, they do not prove it safe when everything goes wrong. Someone still has to risk the one failure that used to mean certain death. The missed wire, the bolter that turns a landing into a sprint toward parked planes. That test will decide whether the angled deck is a clever trick or a life-saving revolution. And it's about to be run. Now Boone faces the ultimate test, not a paper theory, but throttle and bone. He's about to do what would have been suicidal on a straight deck, deliberately miss the wires. It's a controlled catastrophe. engines, nerves, and the ship itself all converge on a single pass. If it fails, it's not just embarrassment, it's disaster. Boone will intentionally aim to miss the wires. On a straight deck, that would mean almost certain death. The jet would slam into parked planes or a barrier at 100 miles an hour. On this new, painted 8-degree line, it's an experiment with human lives. Unknown, terrifying, necessary. The theory is about to meet reality. Boone's jet screams toward Midway's deck like a launched bullet. Engine a banshee, cockpit a pressure cooker, closing the distance faster than any prop plane ever dared. The painted 8-degree stripe flashes under his nose. Deck crews shrink to ants, and the carrier's island looms like a cliff. Every instrument needle is a verdict. Every heartbeat counts. He's committed, hand steady, throttle humming at the edge of the red. This is the moment he will gamble on. He guides the jet down the painted 8-degree lane, throttle steady, eyes locked. He aims high on purpose, too high for the hooks to snare the tailhook. The carrier fills his windshield, the deck a narrow ribbon of steel. Every heartbeat counts. Every foot of runway is a question. He's flying a test not just of skill, but of theory. The jet's tires touch down, the arresting wires whipping uselessly beneath the belly, and for a stomach-churning instant, it isn't a landing at all, but a failure. Speed, metal, and 1,000 what-ifs closing in. The deck feels impossibly short, the world narrows, and for a terrifying moment, every second stretches as the pilot faces one split life-or-death choice. But instead of slamming into a barrier, Boone floors the throttle. The engine screams. The jet rockets along the angled deck, tires skimming painted lines, metal and wind howling past the island. Crew on deck freeze as the fighter hurtles toward the port edge, speed climbing, attitude steady, a single instinctive decision turning an almost certain catastrophe into a sliver of hope. For a long, heart-stopping second, nothing but noise and heat fills the deck. The tires skid, wires lash uselessly beneath, and every muscle in the Midway seems to hold its breath. Then the pilot slams the throttle. The jet surges forward, roars off the painted line, and swings free over the port edge, climbing hard into the sky. He banks, circles, and comes back for another try. Relief washes the carrier like rain. What was theory becomes fact. A missed wire is no longer a death sentence, but a second chance. In one clean, terrifying moment, the angled deck had done its job. One demonstration changed everything. A jet screamed down that painted 8-degree line, missed the wires on purpose, and simply powered up and flew away. And suddenly, the doubters had nothing left to argue. Skepticism evaporated in the roar of the engines. What had been a heated debate among admirals and engineers collapsed into a single, unavoidable truth. The angled deck stopped being an experiment and became an imperative. Overnight, the question shifted from, "Is this safe?" to, "How fast can we do it?" And where there had been hesitation, there was now urgent, full-speed commitment. By late 1951, the Navy had moved past debate and into action. What began as a painted test strip was suddenly a policy, and plans for a fleet-wide conversion were rolling out fast. But make no mistake, this wasn't a quick coat of paint or a line on a map. To angle a carrier's deck meant cutting into the ship itself, reshaping structure, widening the port side, relocating the island, and rethinking every cable and arresting wire beneath. It would be expensive, messy, and technically daring. Still, after Boone's demonstration, the choice was simple. Do the hard work now, or accept catastrophe later. This wasn't a touch-up, it was open-heart surgery for a warship. Retrofitting an angled deck meant stripping the flight deck back to its bones, cutting into the hull, rearranging hangars and elevators, rerouting fuel lines, wiring and ordnance stowage, and reinforcing bulkheads to carry new loads. Every deck below had to be rethought. Shipyards filled with cranes and sparks as teams measured stress, welded miles of new girder work, and balanced weight so the carrier wouldn't list or break in a seaway. It took months, massive manpower, and exacting engineering. Next came the hard details. Widen the port side with a sponson, move the island, and re-engineer the arresting gear. They soon realized it wasn't a paint job at all, but naval surgery. The port side had to be widened with a massive structural sponson welded onto the hull. The island's superstructure lifted and shifted, arresting gear ripped out and completely re-engineered. Decks were opened, hangars reshaped, cables rerouted, an all-hands ship-wide rebuild. And with the flight deck torn apart, there was room to install the powerful steam catapults. But the retrofit created an opening bigger than anyone had expected. When crews tore the decks apart, they didn't just rearrange parking spots, they installed raw power. British-invented steam catapults were slotted into the hull like pistons, able to fling heavier, faster jets off a carrier's bow. Planes that would have been impossible to launch on steam-strained gear could now be hurled into the air with room to spare, turning carriers from fragile, slow turnaround decks into true mobile air bases. It was a quiet, mechanical revolution, simple in concept, brutal in effect, and it changed carrier aviation forever. Between 1952 and 1955, the Navy put 13 Essex-class carriers through radical surgery, long, bloody refits that added sponsons, shifted islands, reworked arresting gear, and bolted in British steam catapults so jets could be thrown off a deck. The first to crawl out in December 1952 was USS Antietam, a battle-scarred veteran reborn with an 8-degree throat. She was more than a prototype, she was a promise. No longer a papered idea, the angled deck walked right into combat. Antietam sailed straight for Korea, destined to prove whether that simple tilt could actually save pilots, planes, and the carrier's fragile supremacy. No sooner had the Antietam rolled off the conversion ways than she was hurled into the crucible of combat, the Korean War, a live, unforgiving test of an idea that began as a painted line. This wasn't an experiment on paper anymore. It would be judged by sorties flown, pilots saved, and missions completed. With new sponsons, steam catapults, and an angled deck, the carrier steamed into action, every landing a verdict. Could an 8-degree twist in steel beat the chaos of war? Off the coast of Korea, the Antietam proved that this wasn't a clever trick on paper, but a battlefield revolution. Sortie generation jumped an astonishing 74% compared with her straight-deck sisters. That meant more strikes, more close air support, more strikes in a single afternoon, and not just numbers on a chart. It meant pilots got back to targets faster, carriers could sustain pressure without long, dangerous recovery gaps, and commanders had an entirely different tempo to wield. A simple tilt in the deck turned carriers from fragile stop-and-start platforms into relentless air bases, faster, safer, and far more deadly. The reason was flight deck availability. With an angled deck, you no longer had to wait an hour while crews wrestled parked, fueled fighters out of the way. Landing and launching could happen at the same time, and bolters could simply go around and try again. That meant a returning pilot's chances of finding an empty, recoverable deck leapt from about 50% to roughly 79%. Not a marginal improvement, but a life or death shift. Fewer men ditched in the sea, sortie cycles sped up, and commanders could keep aircraft aloft much longer. In short, 8 degrees bought time, safety, and combat power. One afternoon in February 1953, over Korea, the angled deck did more than speed up sorties, it saved lives. When damaged, low-fuel planes limped home, there was suddenly room to breathe. An emergency path to touchdown without slamming into parked aircraft. 3 pilots, each facing what would have been a fatal, high-speed collision on a straight deck, found they could land or throttle up and try again. Rumors became fact. Statistics gained faces. The Navy hadn't just fixed an efficiency problem, It had stopped turning pilots into numbers. The design saved not just time, but people. By 1953, the Navy stops experimenting and starts rebuilding. Everything, from now on, will be shaped around that slanted strip of steel. Architects and admirals redraw blueprints, moving islands, widening hulls, and designing catapults and arresting gear to work with an angled approach instead of around it. The Forrestal class is born not as a retrofit, but as a purpose-built beast, a true supercarrier with the angled deck baked into its bones. What had been an ingenious add-on becomes the organizing principle of carrier warfare. The angled deck is no longer a feature. It is the foundation for a new era of naval power. When the USS Forrestal slides into the water in 1954, it isn't a trimmed-up retrofit. It's a new species of warship, designed from the keel up around the angled deck idea. The landing area is no longer a painted line on a straight highway. It's built into the hull itself, a purpose-made runway that reshapes the ship's whole workflow. 2 catapults sit on the bow for immediate launches, and 2 more are mounted on the angled waist, giving the carrier the muscle and geometry to launch and recover aircraft at the same time. It's elegant, it's brutal, and it changes carrier aviation forever. In 1955, the Forrestal turned theory into theater. In a single 47-minute evolution, her crew launched, recovered, and launched again, 3 distinct air operations unfolding at once. Planes flashed off the bow while others bled speed on the angled waist and rolled clear. Wings folding, ordnance reset by crews who moved like clockwork. Short sentences, long procedures. It looked like controlled chaos, but it was geometry made manifest. A simple 8-degree tilt buying time, space, and second chances. For the first time, a carrier could fight, reset, and fight again without becoming a sitting duck. The naval world had quietly just been remade. The strategic implications hit the Soviet Union like a hammer. A whole school of naval thought, built around catching American carriers while they were vulnerable, suddenly had no target. What had been a predictable vulnerability evaporated overnight. Fleet tactics, force projections, even political calculations had to be rewritten. For Washington, the angled deck wasn't just a deck modification. It was a strategic wedge that kept carriers at sea and planes in the air, turning ships into constant, mobile power projection platforms. The Cold War naval balance shifted not by a single battle, but by 8 small degrees of geometry, and rivals were left scrambling to catch up. For more than 70 years, the angled deck has been the global standard, adopted by navies from Britain and France to China and built into the deck plans of the latest American giants like USS Gerald R. Ford. It wasn't a flashy upgrade, it was a seismic rethink that turned the carrier's deadliest failure into a survivable routine. Engineers fixed a brutal, expensive bottleneck not with brute force, but with geometry. An 8-degree tilt that gave pilots a lane to go around instead of smashing into parked aircraft. Elegant and ruthless in its simplicity. A tiny rotation changed naval aviation forever. So, what other massive problems might be solved by equally small, obvious shifts?